Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. I'm Jessica Weiss, the director of the Institute for America, China, and the Future of Global Affairs, or ACF, where we seek to add rigor and reason to the public and policy conversations about China. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome such an esteemed panel of both journalists and my fellow colleagues here at SAIS today to talk about some of the challenges of covering China from within. A second panel later this morning will talk about the challenge of covering China and its increasingly global presence. But for now, let me first introduce my fellow panelists. Directly to my right is Yuan, reporter for the New York Times and the host of a very well-known podcast, Conversations with Yuan, or the Booming By podcast. Next, we have Jodi Schneider, formerly with Bloomberg and currently the governor and press freedom chair at the Overseas Press Club. Welcome, Jodi. It's wonderful to be in partnership with you here today. Next, we have my colleague Chen, the William L. Clayton Chair and Associate Professor of Johns Hopkins University SAIS. And last but certainly not least, my colleague Andy Mertha, the George and Sadie Hyman Professor of China Studies, Director of the China Studies Program, and the Director of the SAIS China Global Research Center here at Johns Hopkins SAIS. So as we gather here today, I think one of the biggest questions when you look at the current media and scholarly ecosystem covering China, I wanted to ask each of you in turn, what do you see as some of the biggest weaknesses? And in short, what are we consistently missing or getting wrong in today's environment? Lee, and why don't we start with you?
Hello? Okay. For me, I think the biggest weakness is there's too much focus on tech, trade, and geopolitics. Those are very important issues, of course, but I think we risk of framing everything through the lens of geopolitics. Like the United States, China is a very big, complex country, and we can't talk about China's tech and manufacturing power without taking into account the economy as a whole and the well-being of its people. That's what I see. I wrote about this in a column maybe in May about two Chinas. There's the hopeful China, what I call the hopeful China, the tech. The world of Alibaba, Tencent, Xiaomi, and Huawei. Those are really world-class companies. But there's also what I call the gloomy China, the weak consumption, the rising unemployment, and the housing crisis, on and on and on. It's like there's a crisis of confidence for general Chinese if you talk to them. And I just think if we want to tell a China story, we have to take into account of both of them. It's just like, when you talk about the United States, you cannot just talk about how powerful the Silicon Valley is. And then without talking about all the other issues this country has. And so that's what I think I would like to say. We talk about both sides and not just talk about, China is winning. The DeepSeek is so wonderful. Look at all the robots China have. Look at the high-speed railways, and all of those are true. But we have to look behind a lot of things behind that. So, and that's what I think. There's what I feel from my years of covering China. I see a tendency of swing from one side to the other, from ignoring, demonizing China to now I kind of feel like a glorifying China. So, it's from like underestimation to overestimation. I just feel like we need to find some kind of like a nuance or the middle ground. Like that's what I feel like we need to. We can give give the readers, give our audience a more truthful portrayal of China. I can keep talking about this because I have so much, so much I can vent about, like from my years of covering China, my frustration of reading all the stories. You know, I film almost every day. I was like, what? They know this? But at the same time, of course, there have been always like wonderful China coverage. I don't want to say like I'm not happy about most of them, but I really say at this moment, especially in the past 7-8 months since the DeepSeek moment, I saw a swing to the other side.
A way to get us started. Thank you. And hopefully we'll dive into some more of those questions in a bit. Jodi, what about you?
Thank you, and thank you for including me in this panel. I think from my perspective as a press freedom advocate and somebody who's cared about this my whole career, that the concern now is not just the concern we've had with China in terms of press freedom and state control of the media, but there are fewer and fewer journalists from outside who are being allowed to work in China. First of all, when you look at the numbers, the Press Freedom Index from Reporters Without Borders, China's 178 out of 180, only Eritrea and North Korea or worse. And we've also seen Hong Kong, where I was and many of us were, where it was there was a fair bit of press freedom. And as recently as 2019, before the protests, Hong Kong had scored in the 70s on that list. They are now much lower on that list. So there's that state control, and when we talk about state control of the media, we don't just mean the state, the media that is owned and run by the state, but they control obviously the visas of journalists going into China, and those have not been granted nearly as freely, and they were always tight. But in recent years, tighter and tighter, and journalists have gotten kicked out of the country. And China controls what journalists do when they are in the country. They are very surveilled. They're watched very closely who they talk to. And that is happening more and more in Hong Kong as well. It's hard to get people to talk to you. So journalists operating there and media publications operating both in China and in Hong Kong are really having to be really creative about ways just to do their work, to do their basic work. Thank you.
Thanks, Jodi. Ling, can I turn to you for the perspective of one scholar, and we'll hear also from Andy as well on this. What do you see as some of the biggest weaknesses in our coverage of China?
Thanks, and my pleasure to be here. So for me, from our scholar perspective, I think the biggest weakness is that we lack a on-the-ground perspective to understand why certain actors behave in certain way and what their intentions are. And as a result, we tend to rely too much on formal leaders' speech, formal documents to interpret the intentions and results, which affects both our work quality and the way in which we interact with each other. Some examples in my field are, let me try to think of examples. So, for example, all the success or increase in China's industrial manufacturing are typically interpreted as state subsidies to state-owned firms as a way to overtake United States. As opposed to, China is having this overcapacity because the real estate bubbles break and so, right? And there's more story behind that. Most of the private firms in China were seen as the tools for Chinese party state as opposed to real private firms. The recent study of over-centralization under the Xi Jinping government, because we have this lack of access problem, are overly relying on documents at the policy documents at the central and the local level, as documents as they printed out as text, rather than what exactly bureaucrats and businesses were doing on the ground. Hence, they cannot explain why in some places they're doing so well, they're actively developing AI, semiconductor, and extra, and in some other areas, they're simply paralyzed. because of that, we want to call for more, just echoing this panel, that we want to call for more nuanced understanding of China. And I believe that this is not only, but having a perspective from within is not only important to understand China from within, it's also important to understand China's foreign policy, because all the foreign policy has their domestic politics, has their domestic messages. I think I'll stop.
Really important set of points, Ling, thank you. We've all voiced a number of complaints here, and I want to also, open space for how have we overcome some of these challenges. And Andy, I know you've led a really important project on studying China in the absence of access. So what are some of the best practices that you've identified for, nonetheless trying to understand China, even given the hurdles that we've been talking?
So if I can, first of all, Jessica, thanks for inviting me to this panel, and I'd like to come back around to that if I could. But I wanted to, I wanted to add to this particular discussion as well. But I want to start by acknowledging the fact that long before on-the-ground scholarship in China, at least US scholarship, became a thing, what we learned most was from journalists. So, when I was first learning about China way back when, people whose work I read over and over again, people like Stanley Carnow, Bob Butterfield, Roger Garside. So there is I would just want to echo what Jim was saying. There's a real, there's real synergy of interests here. In talking about the problems, before I talk about or mention kind of what I'm trying to do in my neck of the woods, is I think there's first of all, there's an arm's length nature of research that is problematic for a number of reasons. Part of this, I think, is due to risk aversion. Some of it's reasonable, some of it less reasonable. I remember those of us who are in positions of some security, which is in the case of say tenured faculty, we were browbeaten by not browbeaten exactly, but by about not recognizing our position of responsibility, of taking the lead when other groups of folks within the academy are at some vulnerability. I remember when first time I went back to China after COVID, I remember sitting around with some colleagues who were living and working in Hong Kong, and they were taking bets on how many hours I'd be detained when I crossed the border. And so I built in an extra 5 hours just in case, and so I ended up sitting at the Shenzhen airport for 5 extra hours because nothing happened. So there is this risk aversion there. The other thing I think, and Ling touched upon this with documents, is that we're getting increasingly reliant on more easily available data. And as a result, it biases and distorts what we know by us really not being able to go into what we don't know. And so that's something, I mean, it's been a perennial problem, but it's just gotten worse. So I think at this point, it's still a difference of degree, not in kind, but I think we're not too far away from that happening. Third thing is that I think for those of us in academia, there is a shift more towards, especially for younger colleagues, a shift towards the intellectual center of our disciplines, which do not necessarily reward in-country expertise. And so that becomes a kind of a vicious circle. And then I wanted to come back and just agree wholeheartedly with Yuan's point about being more than one China. I think the focus on China, and this is a through line for I think a lot of what I'm going to say today, is that we focus on China as a unitary state, which technically it is. But in doing so, we ignore the vast majority of what's going on in China, and frankly, the vast majority of things that keep Xi Jinping awake at night. We think about things in geopolitics, in international terms. We do not think about it in terms of China as an extraordinarily complex state. One of the things, and Jessica very kindly mentioned, one of the things that I've been trying to do with scholars, all of us are doing our little bit to try to mitigate these problems. And one of the things that I've been trying to do is how do we how do we make the most out of such a challenging situation that we find ourselves in? And so one of the things that I've been looking at with other scholars is kind of bringing in people who studied China in the late 60s, 70s, the so-called Pekingologists, to help train those of us who didn't need Pekingology because we took access to China for granted. And so that might help mitigate some of the things that Ling was talking about, not only in terms of just having the documents, but how to actually make sense of them and go through them and read between the lines and make sense of the repetition of silences, Simon Lee's put it. I'm currently working on a second version of that, which is studying China from outside of China. And that's what a lot of people are doing today. There's lots of other ways of approaching this. But I think one of the things that we really, that these questions raise is, okay, so given the situation, how do we actually study China given the hand we've been dealt?